Ephesians chapter 6. Do you know of any dynamic duos? Sure you do. Let me see if you can fill in these partners. Okay? Batman and Robin. Romeo and Juliet. Laurel and Hardy. Bonnie and Clyde. Tom and Jerry. Brian and Heidi. I made that one up. We do know there are special groups of two out there. Some are famous and not all are. But maybe when we get to heaven, maybe the Lord will one day help us to learn some of those unknown giants who served Him and did amazing things together for Him. But I point that out because some of the best duos on the planet are really found in the context of our passage here in Ephesians chapter 5 and 6. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at what it is to submit to one another. That's the driving emphasis, but it's always found within the context of being Spirit-filled people. And I don't know if you've picked it up. I don't think I've pointed it out. I'm sure you probably have picked it up, but really, Paul is dealing with Spirit-filled people in their relationships of groups involving twos. For example, Ephesians 5, chapter 5, verse 22, wives, submit yourselves unto your own who? Husbands. In verse 25 of chapter 5, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. Look there in chapter 6, that's where you are. Look at verse 5. Servants, be obedient to them who are your masters, according to the flesh. Verse 9, and ye masters, do the same. All the ones that Paul are dealing with when it comes to this Spirit filling are in groups of two. But there's a group which I skipped just a minute ago, but it's the groups that we'll look at today. And they're found in verses 1 through 4. Outside of the husband and wife relationship, I would say that this is probably the most important. Maybe it's the outside of moms and dads, this is the second most important duo that we could consider. So follow with me as I read verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, that thou mayest live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. The dynamic duo that we consider today are parents and their children. My title is this: Spirit-Filled Families. And the first group that we're going to look at is the group that we know as children. Spirit-filled children obey. That's what we find in verse 1. Children, obey your parents. Now, those words are pretty plain, are they not? But let's go a little further and let's consider a little more. I've got some little points up there and you can see them, but let's note this, that the children being addressed, they're really not infants. And I would say they're not toddlers. I would even say that they're probably not children who are lower level elementary school children. My guess would be when Paul's writing to children in these verses, he's probably hovering around the teenage years, probably at a minimum. Now, truthfully, we're not given an age here. No one knows exactly who he's speaking with, but it is possible that he's addressing children who are younger than teenagers, but whoever they are old enough to comprehend what Paul is saying. They're tracking with him. The text does not say, parents, teach your children to obey. The text says, children, obey your parents. Now that doesn't mean that parents don't teach them to obey. That's what they're doing when they're infants. That's what they're doing when they're toddlers. That's what they're doing when they're lower elementary. But there comes a day and age when those children are old enough to track with you, to know what's going on. And that's the group Paul seems to be talking to, because he addresses them just like he addresses the wives, just like he addresses the husbands, just like he's going to address the slaves and the masters. He's now addressing children. Children, obey. The call to obedience, though, is not a one-time act. It is a word that in the Greek is an imperative. It's a command. You need to obey. But it's also a present tense imperative, which means ongoing action. It's not, I woke up today and I obeyed my mom. I made my bed. I can be a rebel the rest of the day. It's not a one-time act. It is an ongoing action. It is something we could probably put it this way. Children, keep obeying your parents. And that's a statement that assumes that you've already been obeying them, and it calls you to keep that up. It's not a one-time random act. It's an ongoing action. And somebody says, well, how long do I obey my parents? Paul doesn't give us that answer, does he? My guess is that you obey your parents as long as you are under their roof. There comes a day when a man leaves his father and mother and he marries his wife. He clings to his wife. On that day, there's a new family, a new entity that is involved, and no longer does son obey mom and dad. No longer does daughter obey mom and dad. No, those two are one flesh. They are a new entity. That does not give them the ability to dishonor mom and dad. But when mom and dad call them up and say, honey, sweetie, we just love you. Now, go make your bed. They have the choice to do that or not. But my guess is, as Paul is dealing with children here, he's dealing with children who are still under the roof of mom and dad. And if you are still under the roof of mom and dad, I think that there are certainly things going on that do apply. This is not a one-time act. This is an ongoing action. But then I also see that Paul gives reason for his obedience, his call to obedience, that it's not just on a horizontal level that creates peace in the family. No, it goes beyond that and really is something on a vertical level. It has the vertical in view. Again, note verse 1. Children, obey your parents. What are the next words? In the Lord, for this is right. That's vertical viewing. First, children are to obey in the Lord. Now that phrase, in the Lord, has been cropping up all through this. Again, we're talking about people who are believers. We're talking about people who are Spirit-filled believers. We're talking about people who want to do what God wants them to do. So, as we've addressed the wives, they're to submit to their own husbands as unto the Lord. Husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. Slaves are to be obedient as unto Christ. And what Paul is saying here is that Spirit-filled, humble servants submit themselves to each other. And as they submit to each other, they're ultimately submitting to someone that's far beyond the people that they're under. They are far, far beyond the horizontal. When they submit to each other, they are ultimately submitting to the authority of Christ. That when the wives submit to their husbands, they're ultimately submitting to the Lord. That when husbands, Spirit-filled, are loving their wives, they're putting Christ on display in His love for us. And now as children, when they submit to their parents through obedience, they are showing honor and service to the Lord. Ultimately, when a child obeys, he's obeying God. And that's why I think Paul's addressing these older children who are still at home. It's not that young young children don't know what obedience is. But small children think on a very linear level. And what I mean by that is it's just in a process. I mean, we teach children things that they can understand. When it rains, you put on a raincoat and you use an umbrella because that's what we do when it rains. We don't teach them, now, honey, we put on the raincoat and use the umbrella because the evaporation goes up in the atmosphere, causes these clouds and causes that rain to descend. They don't understand that. They just know it rains, put on their coat. When mom and dad call their toddler, call their elementary school child who thinks on a very linear level, they call them to obey, what they're teaching them is to do that which they may not understand, that which they may not like, but they do it because mom has said, and mom and dad are right. Teaching them to do what they should be doing. But the day and age comes as they develop and as they mature, they gain the ability to understand things beyond the linear meaning. Yes, we obey because mom and dad have taught us to obey, but they get older and they come to the point that they understand that it's not just about obeying mom and dad, that really honoring mom and dad is far beyond that, that honoring mom and dad is to honor and obey Christ. A toddler doesn't understand that. Go to the nursery today. Look at those children and say, do you understand what it is to obey Christ by obeying mom and dad? They're going to show you their tinker toys. The children that are back in the junior church, they know what it is to obey. They sing the song, O-B-E-D-I-E-N-C-E. They understand that, but they may not understand completely what all of that's about. But there comes a day when they do. And at that point, we find Paul pointing it out to these children that they are to obey in the Lord. Because obeying mom and dad is to obey Christ. 4-year-olds don't understand all the ramifications. They learn to obey. But as they get older, that becomes broader, wider, vertical. Now I want to stop right there and I want to kind of address parents that may have small children. And I want to address it in this way. It was Ted Tripp who wrote a book. Again, it's not inspired, but he's writing about children, raising them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. He wrote a book called Shepherding a Child's Heart, and he speaks to parents, and he speaks early on in that book that they have to gain that foundational level of obedience with their children way, way, way early. Children, one of the first building blocks of understanding and growing is to understand what it is to obey. And he makes the point that if you fail on that level, your children are going to struggle for years to come in how they relate to others and how they relate to Christ. So I'm just going to pause right there. And if you've got children that are small, you need to win those battles. You are the parent. And as a parent, no means no. Yes means yes. And right now doesn't mean in 5 minutes. I was not a product of that. I'm not trying to all throw my parents under the bus, but my parents were, the 80s generations. What did you do in the 80s? You know what they did? You know what we learned early to do? Count with them. Now, it wasn't good for us when we got home, but that was bad parenting. That was horrible parenting. Because what that taught us was that we can be rebels. And obedience, It may be important to keep our backsides not being tanned, but we could risk it. You may be a parent who needs to shore up no and yes, because obedience is necessary. And you may need to go to your children and say, honey, I know you don't understand that, but Daddy was wrong, and Daddy's going to change. And Mom is going to change. And our expectation levels are going to change. Because no means no, and yes means yes. And that's final. When they are on that level, toddlers, elementary school, linear thinkers, let them understand yes, no, black and white. It may seem cute when they look at you and grin, but that cuteness is going to wear off and your child is going to be at a disservice. When they're young, if you will be consistent and you will be loving, that will mean you must be firm. Teach them to obey ultimately, because they're not just obeying you, they are obeying Christ. Now, second part of that vertical obedience really is the obedience. It's right. It's the right thing for them to do. Let me see if I have that. I don't think we're ready for that yet. I'll come back. It's right for them to obey because it's the right thing for them to do. If you are a supervisor at work and you go into work tomorrow and you give your workers a simple job and they look at you and laugh at you and say, no, I'm not going to do that, would you think it's cute? No, you'd be looking for new employees because you've got a job to do and you've got bosses over top of you, and if that job doesn't get done right, or if it doesn't get done at all, you're in trouble and you're not going to have that, so you're going to find somebody that's going to do the job as you've asked them to do. You will not stand for it when they tell you no. So, why do you stand for it when your children do? We cut them a break. Paul doesn't cut them a break. Paul takes it a step farther. Look at verse 2. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment, with what? Promise. He's going back into the Old Testament there. He's going to go into the 10 Commandments. He's going to Exodus chapter 20, and he says it's the first one with promise, verse 3, that it may be well with thee and that thou mayest live long on the earth. Now, again, that's coming right out of the Exodus chapter 20. It's coming out of the 5th commandment. And what it has reference probably about is not a sense that if you obey, you're going to be guaranteed your 80 years plus some. But in the Old Testament, what the Old Testament called for is when you had children who were disobedient, not respectful, dishonoring of mom and dad, when you had children that were rebels, you know what the Old Testament prescription for that was? It might have been to take them around the barn, behind the barn, but not with a switch. Now, I know that's not politically correct today. In the Old Testament, you didn't take them behind the barn with a switch. You took them behind the barn with a stone, and you stoned those children to death. Because the Bible, the Old Testament system, law, did not stand for children who dishonored mom and dad. It would not stand for children who would rebel against mom and dad, because ultimately rebellion against mom and dad was rebellion against God. And what Paul here is pulling in is this promise that such children, if they were to honor mom and dad, it's right to honor them, that it may be well with thee, may live us long. It just has the idea that honoring parents had no threat in the Old Testament. You didn't have to fear whether you're going to be stoned or not. It was an insurance that children could enjoy physical well-being and longevity of life simply because they honored. And they honored through obedience. Now, the last time I checked, we don't have any laws on the books that allow us to go and stone our children, do we? So what does that mean for us? Well, it means this, that if you allow your children to be raised in an atmosphere that they are consistently and regularly dishonoring you, they will be a grief to you all of their life. How many children are a grief and a burden to their parents? I would say no one or no thing weighs more upon the minds and hearts of mom and dad than a wayward child. And so often, the waywardness of that child begins at home with a heart that's bent on disobedience. And they sow seeds when they're a toddler. They sow seeds when they're in 3rd grade. They sow seeds when they're in 5th grade. They become teenagers, they become graduates of high school. And so many parents come back and say, where did we get it wrong? Sometimes, not all times, sometimes it was a matter of 5 more minutes. Disobedience that sowed seeds that grew into trees, and they reaped the fruit. Wayward children sometimes begin their waywardness because they've been allowed to disobey. So if you have young children, nip that one. Help them to grow up in a garden of life without the weeds of disobedience. There's going to be lots of things that are going to be bent on their heart. Help them to obey. You may be a child here today, a teenager, someone able to fully comprehend and understand exactly what I'm saying here. And I would say this, you are not a victim. You may have grown up and you may be sitting in a pew this morning with your parents, and you may be ones that say, that's mom and dad. We always got a long leash. Oh no, what's he saying? He's telling mom and dad that they have to be more hard on me. Yes! Because you must beware. You must be careful. In your heart is a constant battle, a struggle between what you've been asked to do and what you want to do. And that struggle's never going to go away. And you will not be able to stand before the Lord one day and say, well, I'm a rebel because mom and dad didn't discipline me enough. No, you're a rebel because you're feeding your rebellious heart. And I am telling you today, able to understand what I'm saying, be careful, be aware. You have a heart and a disposition, a natural man that wants to go its own way. But in the midst of your own way, if you are going to be Spirit-filled, you must. Even when mom and dad don't require it, you must be children who obey. Because your obedience is vertical. Your obedience is not just to mom and dad, it's to the Lord. And it is right. God's call for you is to do what's right. Honor mom and dad so that your life will be encouraging instead of hard. Proverbs 13:15 says, the way of the transgressor is hard. You have a vertical responsibility to live righteously and holy before the Lord. And that is done by honoring those to whom He has divinely placed over you. Honoring mom and dad with your obedience is to honor Christ. Spirit-filled children, obey. Now, the second thing that I'll look at from our passage goes beyond the children, and now it speaks to the parents. Spirit-filled fathers, teach. Verse 4, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now I have to say that it's dealing with fathers, but moms are included here too. That in the ancient system, it was the fathers who had the had the responsibility of being heads of their home. And it was fathers that had the responsibility of educating their children and to bring them up. That burden fell upon fathers' shoulders. So Paul's going to single out fathers here, but in a more general sense, he's really dealing with parents. Parents have the responsibility to teach their children. But notice what they are to teach. Notice what he says. They are not to provoke their children to wrath. Again, that's an imperative. It's called, don't do this. But it is in the present tense. He's not saying stop doing what you've already started. What he's saying is make it a practice not to do it. What I find is that not all children are created equal. Have you seen that? Some of you have multiple children and they're all different. One loves to zig while the other one likes to zag, and they're all doing it at the same time. You think, oh, they're not all created equal. And for some, when they're out of line, I mean, you can go to them, and their heart is so sensitive, you can go to them, and just the look will just cause them to melt, and they just open up and tell you all that they did. And others will look you right in the face with a straight face, and they will lie to you as if they are just as innocent as ever could be. No, Mom, I didn't do that. When you know that they did. What you have to do is determine what's going on in their heart. Regardless of the need, there is this careful calling to deal with each one of them. In wrath, remember mercy. And be careful that you don't exasperate them, Paul is saying. Be careful that you don't crush them. Be careful that you don't create an atmosphere where they are always angry. I'll tell you something else my parents did. Again, bad parenting, not throwing under the bus. It's by God's grace we turn out as we are anyway, right? It's by God's grace we live through the teenage years. But so many parents did what my parents did. Go to your room and wait till your father gets home. You ever had that? That's bad parenting. If you do that, stop it. Right now. Not tomorrow. Today. Because when you send your child up to the room and you wait till your father gets home, you know what that does? It creates a tension in them that makes them angry. All day long they're dealing with, oh no, Dad's coming home. I should have done. I'm justified. And when Dad comes home, there's a war. If there's an issue, deal with it. Deal with it right now. Get it out of the way. Don't let the elephant grow in the room. Get out of the way and move on. Careful that you don't create this atmosphere where they are just always anger. For that anger will one day turn against you. But ultimately, it'll turn them against God. It's not just the horizontal. There's a vertical in play here. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. To put it positively, he's really dealing with our children in this. Bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now you could look at the various versions that we're using as we do our scripture reading. You have the ESV and the New American Standard both say, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The Holman Christian Standard Version and the NIV both say the training and instruction of the Lord. But all of them say, of the Lord. It's the idea that when you're dealing with these children, you're dealing with the vertical as well. That you are teaching them how to live on this planet. Yes, they need to be good citizens. They need to be able to pay their bills. They need to be able to live on this planet without you. But it's more than just living on this planet without you. You are preparing them to live for eternity. One man said this, in other words, the Father's training and admonition is not to be anthropocentric. That's a big word. It is to be Christocentric. What does that mean? He's saying that we're to teach our children to see Christ. We have so much of man in us. That's the anthropocentric. We're the center of our world. We're helping them take themselves out of the center and put Christ there. Our goal is to teach them and to admonish them to follow the Lord. Mom, Dad, how you deal with your children has a major contribution in how they will view God. As God's representative to them, my encouragement, show them Jesus. Start when they're toddlers. Start when they're elementary. Start when they're teenage. Start! Show them Jesus. Let them see that God is a God who has shown you mercy. And the mercy that He's shown you, you'll show to them. Doesn't mean that you give them a pass. But it means that we're not provoking them to wrath, that we're finding ways to encourage them to see the Lord. And that brings me to some final applications. And I'm going to start with a group that really is sitting here just popcorn, enjoying the service. You don't have children. Your children are already come and gone. You've got grandchildren, great grandchildren. You can take a break this week. I'm going to address you first. I'm going to start with those without child rearing responsibility. And here's what I would say to you. 2 things. 1, know your Bible. And 2, look for opportunities to encourage those with small children. You have a sphere of influence. And maybe that sphere of influence is your own children who have your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. Maybe you have neighbors. Look for opportunities to encourage those who have small children. You have eyes, don't you? You have ears. You have a brain. And you can see parents that are on their wits' end because they have unruly children. You've seen that. We've all seen that. My encouragement for you is know your Bible and look for opportunities to encourage such families. Now, I don't know how to do it. Okay? I'm not there. So I'm telling you to do something that I don't know how to do. But let me just give you some examples, some suggestions. They may work, they may crash and burn, but you never know until you try it, right? When you see a young mom who's struggling, take her out for coffee and encourage her. That's what she needs. She doesn't need a lecture. She needs encouragement. Or maybe you can volunteer to watch their children one morning just to give her a break. Or maybe you'll find some other way to encourage them because you in the sphere of your influence have understand them, you know them. Whatever it is, when the Lord brings that young family into your realm, I would encourage you to look for ways to share your experience with them. You've traveled this road before, haven't you? Now, you may have traveled this road in the 80s. Here we are. You may have forgotten a few things. You may have found that some things have changed. You may not remember completely as they... But you can be a help. You can encourage them to overcome some of those struggles and troubles that will come their way. You have experience. Use it to encourage them. Not just giving advice. Give them Bible. Help them see Jesus. Help them to know He knows where they are. And then help them to see that His Word is sufficient to help them along the way. That's your job. That's an opportunity. Now, for those who have teenagers, Don't be like Mark Twain. Mark Twain once said, when you have children, put them in a box, put a hole in the box, feed them through the hole. When they become teenagers, plug the hole. You've heard that. That's bad advice. Funny advice, but bad advice. If you have teenagers, talk to them. They're little adults, or they're children that are becoming adults. And they have a mind, and they have a heart, and they have things that are going on in the recesses of those hearts. And so often we hear and we see teens just clamming up and shutting themselves up in the world of music. Don't ever let them have a TV in their room. Be careful about the media that you allow them in the room. And we've gone beyond TVs, those big boxy things. We now have iPads and cell phones and other things. Be careful about that. They'll shut themselves up in their own little world. And these are the hardest years of their life. And if you want to throw me under the bus, you can. Hey, the pastor said you can't have a TV and all that media in your room. Okay, fine. They can hate me. Don't let them hate you. You parent them. And listen to what they have to say, because their years are just struggle right now. Hormones are raging all over the place. One minute they're laughing, the next minute they're crying, the next minute they don't know what they're doing. Hopes and dreams and desires, they're all out in front. They're being developed. I mean, they want to go conquer the world. And yet, insecurity in them is raging as they're letting go of those little years behind them. And they're trying to take hold of the concept of becoming adult. They want that, but they don't know that they want that. There's insecurity. And if you allow them to escape in the recesses of their heart, you may lose them. Be careful. Talk to them. They're now at an age where they can understand beyond the linear. They can understand beyond the yes and the no because I said so. Talk to them. You may find that you have to go and apologize. You may find that you have to go and say, you know what, we got that one wrong. All of these years we did this and we said that and that wasn't completely right. Help them to see that you didn't always get it right, but help them to see that you didn't have a cheat sheet that said when A happens, then B happens, and you didn't always have the answers. Let them know that while you didn't always get it right, you would always try to do the best for them. Help them to see that. And then sometimes you're going to have to let them fail. Now, when they're little, they're not even toddlers. The infants, when they get into that little moving zone, they're trying to learn how to walk. They stand up for the first time. What do they start doing? Running? No, the first time they stand up, they fall back down. And you think that's so cute because they stand, they fall, they stand, they fall. They're learning to walk. You don't have any problem with that. But now that they're older, they need to learn different skills, and some of those skills is just like walking. You've got to let them fail. You've got to need to let them learn how to make decisions. But if you're always the one making those decisions for them, you're preventing them from learning things that's going to take them on into life. You keep that up. Let me put it that way, if you keep that up, don't be surprised when they're 42 years old, still without direction, living in your basement, playing video games. Some of that goes right back to you. You did not teach them to cut the grass because they couldn't cut it right. Listen, if you want to teach your kid to cut grass, talk to me. I've got a lawnmower out here. Now, Tim's going to beat me up after this because he doesn't like this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I've got a whole field over here. You see these fields? You want to teach them to cut the grass? I've got keys. I'll give them to you, and you can just let them do donuts in that grass out there. What are you going to run over? A building? We'll talk about that later. You need to teach them how to cut the grass. You ought to teach them how to change the car oil. You need to teach them how to do the laundry so that everything's not green. You need to let them learn to handle money and what it is to tithe off that money. Guide them through life and let them fail. Because in their failures, you can teach them to stand back up again and walk. Teenagers, I'm talking to you. I don't know where you are, but I'm talking to you. Be careful how critical you are of mom and dad. They're the only ones you get. Be careful how critical, because they're really not much different than you. Sometimes they're insecure too. But their insecurity doesn't rest on boyfriends and girlfriends. Oh, they're so cute. Their insecurity doesn't rest on what kind of job or career they're going to have. Their insecurity sometimes lies squarely upon how to help you become the person God wants you to be. They're not always going to get it right. And oftentimes they're going to get it wrong. Be careful how critical you are. Sometimes when they don't get it right, let me back up. Sometimes they will get it right. And you don't like it because you don't see it. Again, you're learning. But they've got experience that goes far, far, far beyond you. And in their experience, they have eyes to see further than you can see. And sometimes you may not see it, but they are saving you from yourself. But you lack the wisdom and you lack the experience. And one of these days you may be able to turn around and say, "Thanks, Mom, I never would have guessed that. Thanks, Dad, you preserved me from that." Sometimes we don't get it right. Sometimes we do get it right because we can see it before you. Be careful, teenagers. Be careful of your heart. A war is raging. It's a spiritual war between you and God. But since you can't see God, your eyes are going to focus upon those who represent Him, your parents. Learn to trust them. Learn to talk to them. Learn to seek their guidance and their advice. Learn to love them and appreciate them, because you're learning to love and appreciate God who cares for you through them. Be careful. Now finally, I want to address the parents with young children. Are you tired? Absolutely. Are you weary? No question. My advice, don't give up. Don't quit. Win. There are eternal consequences in the matter. And God has entrusted you with the little souls that you have. Win. Battle. These are those formative years, and as cute as they are, your children will need instruction more than you know. They may have halos, but they're held up by horns, and they won't ever know the full measure of the sacrifice you are giving them. They won't ever know the full measure of your sacrifice until they probably have children of their own. But right now, it's all hands on deck. Right now, it's, can I just breathe? You're helping the formation of their character. And while they are young, your first job is to teach them to obey. Absolute must. You have to do that. Because if they don't learn to obey as a child, they won't obey as a teenager. And more difficulties come. Help your children see. He doesn't get a choice. He wears blue socks because you said he wears blue socks. He wears red pants because you said he wears red pants. And he wears a white shirt because your mom and your dad. Dress him like a clown if you'd like, but he must obey. You represent God to them. And when Israel came out of Egypt, they were Egyptian in every way except for their bloodline. Culturally, they were Egyptian. And God dealt with them with words like you will and you must. And it wasn't until after they'd learned to be more like Him that He gave them mercy and grace. Help your little Johnny and help your little Susie learn that to obey you is to obey God. Teach them to obey. Teach them that God is important. Regularly, consistently bring them to church because they can see that worship is important. Regularly, consistently teach them that tithing is a form of worship. Whether Papa gave them $2 or 25 cents, help them to see we give first to God. Regularly, consistently show them Jesus without anger, but in kindness and grace, that they might grow up to love Him. Now that's a tall order that none of us can do, not in our own strength. We must have the Spirit's help, and yet it's an order that He's called us to do. So, may we ever be parents and children who depend upon God to give us what we need as we endeavor to have harmony in our home. That harmony comes when we have Spirit-filled families. May the Lord help us to be children of God, loving and serving, submitting to one another. Let's pray.